First, here are a few of the facts shaking the Trump White House right now. In those hectic days after Trump fired James Comey, FBI officials were so concerned they began investigating if he was working for Russia. Now, that is different from the known probe into obstruction because of its criminal aspect, a confirmation that the FBI essentially viewed Donald Trump's behavior as suspicious from a counterintelligence point of view. All of that in the New York Times report. And they also note that the agents there were as aghast over Donald Trump's now infamous admissions to Lester Holt about the probe as many of his critics were. So that's the core of the Times story, which was so damning that Donald Trump had to respond to it both yesterday and again today, which I'm going to show you. But first, just consider tonight. Let's do this together. Let's consider how far we've come, and not in a good way. It was July 2017 when many people thought that it seemed potentially exaggerated or partisan for Hillary Clinton's former running mate, Senator Tim Kaine, to say that Trump campaign's actions potentially raised a treason investigation level set of questions. And last year, people also were skeptical when former CIA Director John Brennan was talking about Trump's treasonous actions taken in the pocket of Putin. Now, both of those treason quotes are from Trump critics, so you can factor that in. And then consider again, as we look at how far we've come tonight, when that same line was actually crossed by a respected news outlet, not a critic, but a news outlet. On July 18th, 2018, you're looking at the front page of the New York Times, raising the issue of Trump treason, right there on the debate on the front page. That had never happened before, a line crossed. But Trump's most fervent supporters still argue, well, that's just more Trump criticism from the press. And they would argue the U.S. is not yet at a place where asking if Trump works for Russia is a reasonable inquiry. And they'd say that's why you only hear the question from critics or from parts of the press, but certainly not from Republicans on the record or Fox News. Until now. That line has now also been crossed. These reports so significant, so detailed, so unassailably unignorable, they can't even be ignored on Fox News. And given the chance to deny it, there you had the president not denying it.
Are you now, or have you ever worked for Russia, Mr. President?
I think it's the most insulting thing I've ever been asked. I think it's the most insulting article I've ever had written.
It took 2 more days for Trump to say formally no.
Mr. President, yes or no? Have you, or are you now, have you ever worked for Russia? Yes or no?
I never worked for Russia. And you know that answer better than anybody. I never worked for Russia.
That's the Russian asset side of the story, the president addressing it today. Then there's the alleged cover-up. The Washington Post reporting that after one meeting with Putin last year, Trump confiscated his interpreter's notes from the meeting and told the interpreter not to discuss what happened with his own employees and aides in the Trump administration. The only thing the interpreter was able to confirm was that when Putin denied the Russians meddled in the U.S. election, Trump responded, "I believe you," which is familiar from another meeting a year later in Helsinki.
I have President Putin. He just said it's not Russia. I will say this. I don't see any reason why it would be. President Putin was extremely strong and powerful in his denial today.
Strong, powerful. We also know that after Helsinki, Trump aides could not get a reliable readout of that meeting either, and no detailed records of Trump's face-to-face interactions with Putin at 5 other locations, not just Hamburg, but the dinner there when they spoke with only Putin's interpreter doing the translating, their Helsinki conversation where no one but Trump and Putin and their translators were in the room, and these 2 world leaders' conversations at other events like the G20 in Buenos Aires last month or Vietnam last year. This isn't normal. This is suspicious. The more we learn, the more suspicious it gets. And Trump is willing to take the heat for acting this suspicious and take the heat for openly discouraging witnesses from cooperating with law enforcement, which has more and more people, including now in this new line, more people at Fox News asking why. We begin tonight with Maya Wiley, former councilman and mayor of New York City and a former prosecutor in the Southern District of New York, and a former U.S. Attorney, Joyce Vance, both analysts for us. Maya, what is your reaction to this set of bombshell reports?
My reaction is that this is not just unprecedented, it's extremely dangerous. And part of why it's extremely dangerous is that we are not as a country, not as a whole, not as a nation of people who puts country before party, asking, demanding that we get a formal accounting, that we get a commitment that there is going to be a public accounting to determine whether or not, we don't have to all agree whether the evidence is sufficient at this point, but whether or not we have any reason to be concerned that the single most powerful person in the country may be compromised. This is uncharted territory for this country. We should take it very seriously. Even for those who support Donald Trump, if you support Donald Trump, you should want transparency. You should want his name cleared. You should stop calling news outlets by names rather than addressing the facts. You should absolutely stop suggesting that Mueller's probe should not be protected by legislation. And we should stop having a conversation that suggests that it is somehow inappropriate for the Congress to exercise some oversight to enable the American people to understand what's happened.
Joyce?
So I think Maya is absolutely right. And what's so startling about this new reporting over the weekend is that the FBI thought that there was sufficient predication to open a counterintelligence investigation into the president. Counterintelligence cases are different from times when the FBI investigates a criminal case. Then they're looking to see whether or not someone has violated a specific criminal law. But in counterintelligence cases, they're looking to see whether there's a threat to our national security. And as Maya says, uncharted waters when you're talking about the president, the head of the executive branch, because the Constitution simply didn't contemplate a president who would be either a witting or unwitting agent of a foreign power. There was enormous sensitivity for the FBI to take this step, which they knew, they had to know would have been very inflammatory at some point. They had evidence, some of which we've seen now thanks to this reporting from the Times and the Post, but I feel certain a great quantum of evidence. Most of that iceberg is submerged below the water. The New York Times story says nothing has ever publicly been disclosed that links the president despite opening the investigation. That reporting doesn't rule out the fact that that evidence exists. I think the country and the president is due for quite a reckoning when all of the facts are disclosed.
Joyce, the New York Times article goes through part of, as you say, what the FBI was looking at to reach this conclusion. What more do you think they would have needed? I mean, it doesn't seem that simply the removal of an FBI director would take you to this level, although, as noted, that firing was rare and done in an odd way. There are past presidents who've removed senior officials in all sorts of ways.
That's right. And counterintelligence investigations aren't meant to be opened and shut with a conclusion reached. What they're really doing is they're looking for information. They're identifying a threat and they're trying to neutralize that threat. So they can go on for many, many years. It's not as simple as looking at one event, but that one event might have been particularly telling, especially in light of what happened after Jim Comey was fired, where Russians were invited into the Oval Office with no American press involved. We learned about the fact that Ambassador Kislyak was there from the Russian press. And that sort of incident, when you layer them one on top of the other, would give the FBI reason to continue to investigate. We don't know if they at some point reached a conclusion and decided that their concerns had been ill-founded and there were no problems, or if they ultimately concluded there was more of a threat. But like you say, one event in and of itself doesn't make these investigations, and the FBI would have had just a serious quantum of evidence over a long timeline to get there.
And Maya, I want to draw you out on sort of the way the president has handled this, because it has become something of a pattern now where people see reports that are distressing, that might have had a bigger impact on other presidents, and that feel like they just grind on. And yet, the very fact that this has punctured what may be a universe or a bubble of Fox News, as I've argued tonight, itself is interesting and telling. The president also responding to it point by point at times after delay. I want to play for you also in that interview his attempt to say, well, this is just like how he deals with other high-level foreign meetings. Take a look.
I met with every leader, just about individually. I meet with Modi. I meet with, in Japan, I meet with Abe. I meet with all of them. But nobody says anything. But I meet with Putin, and they make a big deal. Anybody could have listened to that meeting. That meeting is open for grabs.
Some of what's there is just obviously a lie. The whole point is it's not open for grabs. I didn't know that was an expression. I think up for grabs is more what I think of.
Access Hollywood taught us it is.
Wow. I hadn't made that literary connection. But beyond word choice, what do you think of that defense and what he's doing and the fact that he feels the need to mislead or lie about saying this is basically like other meetings, and it's always the reaction to Russia, not the fact that it seems to always come back to Russia?
Well, part of the reason that Donald Trump has a problem now is because he has a history and a pattern of lying. So, and this goes, I think, back to the same question that you asked Joyce, which is, if you look at what the FBI knew and was witnessing, it was, first of all, witnessing a candidate that clearly, as we know, had business dealings and was going after business dealings in Russia, and publicly telling everyone who asked that he was having no business conversations with Russia. We know that was a lie now. We know that from Michael Cohen that he was directed, actually, to pursue lines of business, at least till June and looks like even into the fall of 2016. You have him being briefed by the FBI about the activities and the potential for infiltration of his campaign by Russians. He had 7 people having contact with Russians during his campaign. The FBI asked him and the campaign to let them know about contact with Russians. As far as we know from the record that we've seen, that did not happen. Then, of course, you have the fact that not only his campaign manager, right? I mean, the person who was chairing his campaign changed the Republican platform in a way that was beneficial to the policy interests of Russia. You then also had the fact that Michael Flynn, who was his advisor, lied about having communications about sanctions in Russia with Ambassador Kislyak again. I mean, we don't even have enough time to go down the list, both of facts that in and of themselves give us a whole public mountain of information that actually makes it clear that the FBI was right to be concerned at the point he then fires Comey and says it's about the investigation.
Says it's about the investigation and then holds another private meeting, not with Putin, but with Russian diplomats to say this is ease the pressure off him and only allows the Russian press to cover it. It's overwhelming when you put it all like that. Maya, thank you, and stay with me because I want to bring you on one other item later in the show. Joyce Vance, thank you as well. Appreciate it. What I want to do now is turn, as promised, to an interview with a House Democratic chair. The Dems are in the majority, and they are moving to investigate many things, including these new reports. Now, Eliot Engel, the incoming chairman here, the new chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, is saying there'll be a subcommittee to investigate all of these encounters with Putin and Trump. And there are reports that Engel is also considering whether to subpoena Trump's interpreters to learn about those meetings. I'm happy to say tonight on The Beat is New York Congressman Eliot Engel, the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. A busy day for you. Thanks for joining me tonight.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
We went through some of what you reportedly been doing. In your view, was this story, when you read it, a surprise to you? And what are you going to do to get the interpreter to provide information to Congress?
Well, of course it was a surprise. It still is a surprise. I still pinch myself to think that this is really happening. And I think that the president would want to cooperate to clear himself if indeed he feels he needs to be cleared. But we have had a difficulty with the Russians since they interfered in our election for president in 2016. And we know they interfered in trying to help the president. And what happens now, of course, is the president is cozied up to Putin all the time since he's been president. And it makes you scratch your head and think there's some kind of nefarious connection. When you add the fact that apparently the president tried to hide notes that were taken of his encounter with Putin when only the two of them were in a room, it just makes you think again, there are too many things going on at one time to just walk away from this and say, well, they're all coincidences. So we're going to look at it and we're going to make a judgment accordingly. But I want to just say that the House is the branch of government, the legislative branch of government, and we have checks and balances, and we're supposed to get involved in such things.
Well, and the big check, Congressman, as you know, is the subpoena power. If this interpreter does not show up voluntarily, are you prepared to subpoena the interpreter?
Well, no decision's been made. Obviously, we're still in the beginnings of it. Congress is first putting together the committees. We don't even know all the members on, but we're going to look at all aspects. I would think a subpoena would be a last resort, not a first resort. I would hope it wouldn't have to get to that. I would hope that there's cooperation. The American people have the right to know.
Other than what we've learned, do you feel that this is the end of the Putin meeting story, or is there more information that you would expect may come out through your investigation, through what appear to be congressionally related leaks as to what the FBI's general counsel had said regarding the other thing, the probe that was looking at whether the president himself, it's weird to say, hard to say perhaps, but the president himself was a national security threat to the United States?
Well, I would find that hard to believe. I think most people would find it hard to believe, and I think it would be in the president's best interest to come clean and release whatever papers he has. You know, there's been, since the election of 2016 and since Trump became president, there's always something about him with Putin. President Trump has criticized our allies and friends, has criticized the NATO alliance, has criticized all kinds of things that various presidents have just taken for granted, the American people have taken for granted. But when it comes to Putin, he's cozy with him. It really makes you think. And the more we hear about this, the more we think that what else is there that we don't know about.
And while I have you, given that you run this most important foreign policy committee, these reports that John Bolton was soliciting potential plans to attack Iran, your response?
Well, I think the United States needs to be careful before it involves itself in other wars and other attacks. I think that we've learned our lesson, or should have learned our lesson. I don't think the American people want any kind of prolonged difficulties that would come with such an attack. I happen to think, by the way, that leaving Syria was a mistake, and I have trouble in general with the foreign policy of this administration, which I call fly by the seat of your pants foreign policy. There's no consistency to it. Leaving Syria leaves our ally Israel in jeopardy, and it certainly leaves our friends, the Kurds, who have fought side by side with us, in great jeopardy. So I think that that's something that troubles me a great deal.
Well, a lot of big and troubling questions here about U.S. foreign policy under this administration right now. You're the one in the driver's seat in the House with the new chair, and you're saying the subpoena is at least on the table, but not a first resort on the Putin translation issues. Chairman Engel, thanks for joining me tonight.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.